In the mid-19th century, the United States was at a crossroads. Opinions between the North and South differed greatly on the issue of slavery, leading to an unprecedented bloody conflict. The American Civil War was not just a battle between armies. It was a war over the future of an entire nation. For 4 years, the country was divided against itself, with hundreds of thousands killed in fierce battles for freedom, rights, and equality. Today, we will go back to those pivotal historical moments to uncover the causes that led to this war and trace its impact, which still affects the United States to this day. Enjoy watching. On May 22, 1856, Representative Charles Sumner was sitting in his office after a stormy session of the United States Congress, delivering a fiery speech against slavery, calling it one of the greatest sins and demanding its abolition in America. After the hearing ended, South Carolina Representative Burston Brooks, a slavery supporter, walked in on him. Brooks, looking calm, violently attacked Sumner with his cane, severely injuring Sumner and temporarily losing sight. Brooks continued beating Sumner until the stick broke, then continued beating him with the handle of the stick until Sumner lost consciousness. Some members of Congress tried to intervene, but Brooks's friends blocked them. After the attack ended, Brooks left the broken baton and left quietly, leaving Sumner in a critical state between life and death. This incident provoked mixed reactions in the United States. In the North, mass rallies in support of Sumner and demanding that Brooks be prosecuted took place, and Sumner's speech was printed and widely distributed. In the South, Brooks was greeted as a hero, and citizens sent him thousands of sticks as gifts in support. This incident sparked the American Civil War. Five years after the incident, a civil war erupted that saw fierce North-South clashes involving 3.5 million soldiers, killing 620,000 people, about 2% of the population. The American Civil War was the result of deep divisions between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. In the North, slavery was beginning to fade, while in the South it was an essential part of the agricultural economy based on the cultivation of cotton. These differences have made it difficult for the United States to continue as one country with two different systems. In the North, a strong movement for the abolition of slavery emerged, driven by a sense of guilt about the existence of slavery in part of the country. This movement glorified figures such as Harriet Tubman, who led a movement to smuggle slaves from the South to the North, and Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became an activist and writer against slavery. Harriet Stowe also wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which described the suffering of slaves and aroused the sympathy of the world. In the South, slavery was an integral part of economic and social life, and there was a strong rejection of any attempts to abolish it. This North-South conflict eventually led to the outbreak of the Civil War, which was one of the bloodiest wars in U.S. history, and established the United States as we know it today. In the mid-19th century, the United States was sharply divided on the issue of slavery. In 1856, Kansas witnessed armed clashes between supporters and opponents of slavery, known as the Kansas Hemorrhage. These clashes were an expression of the deep and growing division between North and South. Among the controversial figures of the period was John Brown. Heavily influenced by the stories of escaped slaves he met, Brown decided to devote his life to anti-slavery. In 1855, Brown and his sons formed an armed gang to smuggle slaves from the South to the North, sometimes to Canada. Their operations included not only slave smuggling, but also revenge attacks against slave owners. In 1859, Brown devised a bold plan to capture the Harper's Ferry military base in Virginia, with the goal of sparking a slave revolt. Brown attacked the base with a small group of men, but his plan failed when the slaves did not heed his call. Brown and his sons ended up trapped inside the base, killing 2 of his sons and severely injuring him. After a 2-month trial, Brown was executed on December 2, 1859. Brown's rebellion frightened the hearts of slavery supporters in the South, prompting them to arm themselves and form military militias, which later became the core of the Confederate Army. Meanwhile, the political divide was deepening. In the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln, the new Republican Party candidate, won the presidency. Lincoln was opposed to the spread of slavery, angering Southern states. In December 1860, South Carolina declared its secession from the United States, followed by several other Southern states. This separation led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. After declaring its secession from the United States, the Southern states formed a new union under the name the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as its president. Meanwhile, President Abraham Lincoln attended his inauguration in a somber atmosphere, affirming his determination to bring the rebellious states back into the Union by force. On April 12, 1861, the Confederacy fired the first cannon shot at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, leading to the fort's surrender after 36 hours of bombardment. In response, Lincoln declared war on the Confederacy, calling on citizens to volunteer for the Army. Although the U.S. Army was small at the time, the rising tensions spurred thousands from both the North and the South to enlist. In the South, slavery was a fundamental part of the agricultural economy, especially in the cotton industry, while in the North, a strong cultural and intellectual movement against slavery had emerged. This divide escalated tensions, and with the outbreak of war, the Southern states began arming themselves and forming military militias. On July 21, 1861, the first major battle of the American Civil War took place at Manassas, near Washington, D.C. The battle began with Union forces performing well, but as time passed, the Northern Army collapsed in the face of Southern forces, leading to a chaotic retreat of Union soldiers and panic among the spectators who had come to watch the battle. The American Civil War became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 19th century, with fierce clashes between the North and South along a front stretching over 1,600 kilometers. General Robert E. Lee, who resigned from the U.S. Army, led the Confederate forces and achieved significant victories in the early stages of the war. By the end of the first day of the Battle of Manassas, the shock was evident to all. The battle was far from the simple and swift confrontation many had expected. It had turned into a river of blood and the mangled bodies of soldiers. Thousands of Union soldiers from the North were either killed or severely wounded, underscoring the unexpected strength of the Southern forces. Despite the fact that the Confederate soldiers weren't wearing uniformed military attire and fought in ordinary clothes, they proved to be fierce fighters equipped with enough weapons and well-devised military strategies. The Battle of Manassas was the first major reality check, revealing to everyone that this war would neither be short nor easy. In response to the Union's defeat, Abraham Lincoln decided to appoint a new general to lead the army, selecting General George McClellan. McClellan reorganized the defeated army and called for more soldiers and supplies. However, despite preparing the army and demanding additional troops, McClellan was hesitant to attack, which frustrated Lincoln. After months of preparation, McClellan finally decided to advance on the Confederates in Richmond with a massive army. But the road to Richmond was fraught with swamps, causing delays and exposing the Union Army to a clever ruse by the Confederate forces. Meanwhile, in the Western theater of the war, another general was rising to prominence, Ulysses S. Grant, who secured a series of victories against the Confederates. By the end of 1862, the war had reshaped everything in America. While McClellan's large army was bogged down in the Virginia swamps, Grant's forces were making significant progress in the West, and the name of General Robert E. Lee was beginning to stand out as a brilliant strategist leading the Southern Army. On the economic and diplomatic front, the Confederacy decided to cut cotton production by 90% and burn 2.5 million bales of cotton at ports, aiming to pressure Britain and France into intervening in the war on their side. This move was intended to demonstrate that American cotton was tied to slavery and couldn't be obtained without it. Despite some military and diplomatic victories by the Confederacy, the North was not as weak as it might have appeared. The Confederate Army was able to repel Union attacks along the front lines, but it struggled to deal with the waves of escaping slaves fleeing to the North. These slaves traversed forests to escape their Southern owners, which further weakened the Southern economy. Although Abraham Lincoln hated slavery, he was initially unable to make an official decision to abolish it at the beginning of the war. He feared that doing so might lead to more states rebelling. Instead, he offered financial compensation to slave owners who freed their slaves and explored the idea of establishing free colonies for runaway slaves in Liberia. In mid-1862, General George McClellan's Union Army was taken by surprise by an attack from the Confederate forces led by General Robert E. Lee. Although the Union Army managed to repel the attack, McClellan panicked and announced the withdrawal of his forces back to Washington. This unexpected victory gave the Confederacy the confidence to launch an offensive into the North. At the Battle of Antietam, McClellan's army faced Confederate forces in a brutal confrontation that resulted in 12,000 Union casualties and 10,000 Confederate casualties, representing a quarter of Lee's army. Despite the heavy losses suffered by the South, McClellan hesitated to press the attack, squandering a golden opportunity for the Union to gain a decisive advantage. As everyone waited for General McClellan to complete the offensive and eliminate Lee's retreating army, McClellan decided to pause and postpone, much to the chagrin of President Lincoln, who tried unsuccessfully to convince him to attack. Doubts began to swirl about McClellan's intentions, with some believing he was deliberately deferring to run against Lincoln in the next election. In the end, Lincoln decided to remove McClellan from Army command. Meanwhile, the front was stalled, and Southerners' hopes for pressure on the North to retreat increased. Lincoln decided to respond to the aspirations of the South with the Emancipation Proclamation of September 1862, which stated that all slaves in the United States would be free by January 1st, 1863. This revolutionary decision delighted the North and angered the South, with Southern President Jefferson Davis calling it the most decadent law in human history. On the battlefield, both sides suffered more diseases than bullets, with diseases such as typhoid and dysentery killing large numbers of soldiers. An economic crisis also began in the South as a result of the blockade imposed by the Union Army, which led to a rise in commodity prices and the collapse of the Confederate currency. Under these circumstances, General Robert Edward Lee decided to make a bold move by attacking the North for supplies. In June 1863, the Army of the South entered Pennsylvania, confiscating crops and paying for them with worthless Confederate currency, and searched for free slaves to return them to slavery. After the Confederate Army overran Pennsylvania, the Army of the North moved quickly to catastrophe. The two armies met in a small town called Gettysburg, which would become the scene of the most important battle in the history of the American Civil War. For 3 days, the Battle of Gettysburg was described as the bloodiest event in U.S. history. Entire military companies were wiped out by cannons, and human limbs and corpses were scattered along the plains surrounding the city. On the third day, the battle turned into close engagements as soldiers docked with their bodies, using pistols and bayonets in heavy fighting. By the end of the day, the superiority of the Northern Army was evident. General Robert Edward Lee asked his commander George Beckett to assemble his battalion for a counterattack, but Beckett replied that his battalion had been completely annihilated. Lee realized that he had made a strategic mistake by going out on a campaign against Pennsylvania and withdrew after losing 28,000 soldiers, while the Union Army lost 23,000 soldiers. News of the battle reached President Lincoln, who greeted it with conflicting emotions. He was saddened by the loss of 51,000 Americans, but happy with the great victory that brought the war to a close. However, he had to pay for this victory with a new decision to recruit every American between the ages of 20 and 45, with the possibility of paying $300 for exemption from service. The decision angered people, especially Irish New Yorkers, who felt Black people were competing for jobs. A conscription uprising erupted in New York, with thousands attacking conscription offices and blacks, burning churches and homes, and carrying out street executions. The riots continued for 3 days until the army intervened to impose order. Meanwhile, blacks first began to enlist in the military, but faced discrimination in pay and promotions. Although the war began over the issue of slavery, each side tried to portray the problem differently. The North said the problem was rebellion against the Union, while the South said the problem was the imposition of laws on the states. However, everyone realized in the middle of the war that the real issue was slavery. In mid-1863, a new military commander appeared to command the armies of the North, General U. South Grant. Despite his impressive military record, Grant was a stranger, known for his untidy clothes and alcoholism. When Lincoln appointed him commander of the armies of the North in 1864, the shape of the front changed completely. The battles became continuous and permanent, and the war turned into a ceaseless death machine. In 1864, the American Civil War continued to claim countless lives without any significant progress. In some battles, bodies piled up in layers up to 4 deep, and General Grant ordered the burning of forests to kill the wounded, who could not move before reinforcements arrived. The Union Army's losses reached 50,000 dead per month, shocking everyone, including Mary Lincoln, the president's wife, who referred to Grant as a butcher. Despite these losses, Grant's ultimate goal was to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. In response, the Confederates dug trenches around their positions, and the Union soldiers countered by digging their own, creating a 32-kilometer-long tangled maze. However, neither side made any decisive progress, and despair spread among both armies. In 1864, a new presidential election loomed, and Lincoln needed to be re-elected in the midst of the difficult circumstances of the war. His popularity was at its lowest, even within his own Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Democrats nominated General George McClellan, whom Lincoln had previously dismissed. The election became a referendum on the war itself. Voting for Lincoln meant support for continuing the war, while voting for McClellan signaled a desire for peace. Despite all the difficulties, Lincoln refused an offer from the Confederates to end the war in exchange for repealing the Emancipation Proclamation. Suddenly, good news began to reach Lincoln. The Union Navy achieved a major victory in Mobile Bay, and General William Sherman captured Atlanta, giving a massive boost to Lincoln's election campaign. Thanks to these victories, Lincoln won the election with 55% of the vote. At the same time, both northern and southern prisons were overcrowded with prisoners, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. In Andersonville Prison in Georgia, which had a maximum capacity of 10,000 prisoners, there were 33,000 crammed in under harsh conditions, leading to the deaths of more than 13,000 prisoners in a single year. Amid these dire circumstances, General William Sherman emerged as a new hope for ending the war. After his victory in Atlanta, he proposed a daring plan to General Grant, involving a march from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying everything in his path. Grant approved the plan, and Sherman began by burning Atlanta, then led a retaliatory march that devastated everything in Georgia. Upon reaching Savannah, Sherman decided to launch a new campaign of destruction in South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. This campaign aimed to punish the South for starting the war, and the suffering in South Carolina was far greater than what Georgia had endured. As the American Civil War drew to a close, the Union's Eastern Army in Virginia was tightening its complete siege on the South. Confederate leaders began to realize that defeat was imminent due to starvation, as they no longer had enough food. Many Southern residents fled, becoming refugees. Some went to Texas, while others headed to the capital, Richmond, in search of assistance. The North's plan was clear. Sherman the Butcher would destroy cities and cut off supplies, while Grant the Noose would strangle the capital with a blockade. On March 25, 1865, the last battles of the American Civil War began in Petersburg, where 125,000 Union soldiers faced a ragged Confederate army of 35,000. Within minutes, the battle was decided, and General Robert Edward Lee realized that the end had come. As he withdrew, Lee sent a message to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, requesting the evacuation of Richmond. The Confederate government panicked, and its members began to flee. At dawn, Union forces arrived in Richmond and destroyed everything, including government archives. Despite all this destruction, Davis refused to surrender and announced that his army would continue to fight with a new tactic. However, the Confederate army was in shambles, and in a final attempt to survive, Lee tried to move his army from one place to another, but Grant pursued him relentlessly. By early April 1865, only 25,000 ragged soldiers remained in the Confederate army. On April 9, 1865, a messenger from the South arrived at the Union camp, carrying a white flag and a letter from Lee requesting surrender. Lee and Grant met, and Grant agreed to generous surrender terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their arms and horses, and providing them with 25,000 rations of food. On April 12, 1865, the official surrender agreement was signed. 2 days later, President Lincoln was celebrating victory at a theatrical performance in Washington. During the celebration, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who was a pro-slavery supporter. On the morning of April 15, a grand funeral was organized for Lincoln. With the war's end, Jefferson Davis was captured, and the conflict concluded with harsh memories, destroyed cities, and staggering death tolls. A total of 3.5 million men were drafted, with 620,000 of them dying. Despite all the devastation, there was a significant level of forgiveness after the war, as there were no widespread acts of revenge or trials. At the end of the American Civil War, a new phase of debate emerged regarding the legacy of military leaders like Robert Edward Lee. His statues periodically spark political crises, as some view him as a symbol of military genius, while others see him as a symbol of defense of slavery. Despite the respect for the peace that followed the war, Lee's ideas remained contentious. On the other hand, Ulysses S. Grant's post-war reputation did not shine as brightly as Lee's, despite being the victorious commander. Grant ran for president and succeeded, but his administration was marred by corruption, impacting his legacy. Meanwhile, freed slaves did not receive compensation or land, continuing to live under harsh conditions, which perpetuated racism and segregation for a long time. Although the war ended, the policies of segregation and the devaluation of Black lives persisted, associating Black people with crime and poverty. This situation continued until the Civil Rights Act was declared in 1964, granting Black individuals most of their rights. The American Civil War remains present in American memory, reminding them that national unity is a fragile concept that can unravel at any moment. Finally, don't forget to check out previous and new episodes, explore the sources, and if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel.